All right, welcome back to our study of the book of Revelation here on the listener's commentary. And as we get going on this recording, I want to mention that on the website, the Revelation landing page at listenerscommentary.com/revelation, if you go to that website, there's a free little Revelation study guide that I've put together that gives some of the backstory information we talked about in that recording. It gives some charts that help us see the structure of the book, which is what we're going to talk about in this recording, as well as some kind of cultural context and history for the book. So that's free on the Revelation landing page. So if you go to listenerscommentary.com, you can click the Listen tab at the top. There'll be a drop-down menu. The bottom will be the Book of Revelation. Click that. It'll take you to the Revelation page, and there on that page, there'll be a place to put in your name, email address, and download a PDF of the study guide. So you can check that out there. I think it could be really helpful to you just to get a picture of what's going on in the book of Revelation. In this particular recording, what I want to do is I want to focus on looking at sort of a big picture overview of the book of Revelation. And this really grew out of a time when I was reading through and particularly listening through the book of Revelation over and over and over again. There was this time where I was doing that, particularly when I was driving around town, and I would just listen to Revelation. And as I did that, it seemed like the structure of the book became much more clear to me. So I want to share some of that with you in this recording, just to help you have sort of a map, a lay of the land as to how the book of Revelation is laid out and works. But first, I want to give you 4 different approaches to the book of Revelation, because there are different schools of thought on how we should read this book and how we should understand this book. And those schools of thought really kind of boil down to like 4 big categories. So that's what I want to do real quickly here, just give you 4 categories or 4 approaches to the book of Revelation. One is known as the preterist approach. The preterist approach predominantly sees the book of Revelation, at least the bulk of it, as all being fulfilled in the first century or shortly thereafter, that it was all 100% for the original audience. Its message was only for them and about them, and everything that's said in the book occurred during their time period or shortly thereafter. That's the preterist approach. There is also the idealist approach. The idealist approach sees the book of Revelation as really predominantly a book that pictures the conflict between good and evil that goes on in this world, and ultimately God's victory over evil. So it sees it as presenting sort of like the idea, hence idealist, the idea of the conflict between evil and good and God's victory over that. That's the idealist approach. Then there has been the historicist approach, or sometimes referred to as the continual historical approach. And the big idea of that approach is it sees Revelation, particularly the visions in the middle of Revelation, going in approximate chronological order, describing various periods in church history up until Jesus returns again. That's the historicist or continuous historical approach. One of the interesting things about that approach is that virtually everyone who has taken that approach, and it's particularly been popular post-Reformation, and it seems to kind of have faded out. It's not nearly as popular, but people who have taken that approach have always seen that they're living in the final period right before Jesus returns again. So just an interesting feature about that approach. And then there is the futurist approach. And the futurist approach sees the book of Revelation as all pertaining to events in the future from the original audience and even from today, in the future, particularly depicting the last 7 years of history prior to Christ's second coming, describing the Great Tribulation or the times of trouble in those last 7 years before Christ returns. That's the futurist approach. So those are 4 different schools of thought on how the book of Revelation works. They all tend to see the first 3 chapters as messages to the original 7 churches, though they, depending on their approach, might see some things within those messages that are distinctive of their approach to the book. Most of them then tend to see the last couple chapters, chapters 20 through 22, as either symbolic of heaven and victory, the preterist and idealist approach see it that way, or as descriptions of the millennium and then heaven and ultimate victory, depending on the approach. And so, 4 different approaches to the book of Revelation. Here's what I would say about those 4 approaches is there's certainly some element of the preterist approach in the book of Revelation. It was addressed to an original audience, these original churches, and some of the symbols are clearly pertinent to their situation. When the book of Revelation says the 7 heads on which the woman sits are 7 hills, everyone in the first century knew we were talking about the city of Rome because she's the city that sits on 7 hills. So clearly there is sort of like an ancient and thus preterist sort of idea and message being communicated. And yet, certainly there are things within the book that go beyond the original time period and point forward, and thus there's a future element to the book. And the book is clearly communicated by means of dramatic symbols. So I think there's something to be said for the idealist approach. And so Revelation really is hard to categorize as to exactly how to approach the book. I tend to think there's some real value to both the preterist and idealist approach, but I don't know that I totally fit into either one of those categories completely. All right, now let's talk about an overview of the book of Revelation. How is the book laid out? So first, what I want to do is I want to just kind of label the parts because there's so much going on in Revelation. The literature is so different from what we're used to that we get lost in the details and it's hard for us to track what's going on. So let me just, like 30,000 foot, just label the parts of the book. Then I'm going to come back and kind of give a macro structure of the book. So here's the parts. The book opens in chapter 1 with an introduction and greetings because it is also a letter and a bit of a prologue. And that prologue entails a glorious vision of Jesus with all sorts of dramatic symbols that draw from visions of God in the Old Testament. So a glorious vision of Jesus who is present among the churches. That's chapter 1. Then in chapters 2 and 3, you get individual messages to each of the original 7 churches to whom the book of Revelation was addressed. After that, in chapters 4 and 5, we get a vision of the heavenly throne room. We're ushered into God's throne room. And this really is like the central and anchoring vision for the whole drama. Everything else is kind of laid out from this vision. And God is the key actor, and he's on his throne in the book of Revelation. So we get that in chapters 4 and 5, this vision of the heavenly throne room. And then flowing out of that vision in chapters 6 through chapter 8, verse 1. There's a really terrible chapter break there, but chapter 6 through chapter 8, verse 1, we get the vision of the 7 seals. And then after the vision of the 7 seals, we get the vision of the 7 trumpets in chapter 8, verse 2 through chapter 11. And this vision includes also a vision of the 2 witnesses. So that's the 7 trumpets and the 2 witnesses in chapters 8 through 11. After that, in chapters 12 through 14, we're introduced to the dragon and the 2 beasts, the beast from the sea and the beast from the earth, chapters 12 through 14. Following the introduction of those characters, we get the 7 bowls of wrath in chapters 15 and 16. And then we zoom in, kind of like on the last bowl. We kind of like, let's just focus on that last bowl a little bit. And we get the 2 beasts and their destruction, as well as the destruction of Babylon in chapters 17 through 19. And then finally, in chapters 20 through 22, we get a description of the destruction of the dragon and final judgment and the new earth in those final chapters of the book of Revelation. So there you go. That's all the parts of the book of Revelation. Now the question is, how do they all fit together? So what I want to do is give you my best understanding of the structure of the book, like how it's arranged and how it's laid out so that we have a map for the book of Revelation. And remember that one helpful way to think about the book of Revelation is it's like a play, like a a grand stage drama with all sorts of characters, and it really does tell a story. So with that image in mind, here is how I understand the macro structure of the book of Revelation, like the big structure. And that is, Revelation is really like a two-act drama, a two-act play with several scenes in each act. So you have the introduction, greetings, and prologue in chapter 1. Then you have the message to the churches. After that, the drama begins, and it's laid out in two acts. Act 1 is chapters 4 through 11. Act 2 is chapters 12 through 22, verse 5, and then you get an epilogue after that. So in Act 1, what you have is three key scenes. You get the first scene is the vision of God's throne room and of Jesus, the Lamb who was slain, who's now given authority over what happens in the world. Scene 1, Act 1. Then we get Scene 2 in Act 1, and that's the vision of the seven seals as the Lamb now opens each of the seven seals and unleashes various things into the history of the world. And then we get Scene 3, the seven trumpets, which includes that vision of the two witnesses as well. So that's Act 1. Then, as you read or listen to the book of Revelation, there's a clear break between chapters 11 and 12. It's like we've come to the middle part of the play, and the curtain falls, and it's intermission in a play, right? If you've ever been to a play and there's an intermission in the middle, well, that's sort of what happens in the middle of the book of Revelation between chapters 11 and 12. And the stage is reset. And when the curtain opens on chapter 12, there's new characters now. There's the dragon and his two henchmen, the beast from the sea and the beast from the earth. And those characters now dominate the whole second half of the drama of the book of Revelation. So Act 2 includes several scenes, the first of which is the introduction of the dragon and the two beasts. And then after that, in Scene 2 of Act 2, we get the seven bowls of wrath. And then Scene 3 zeroes in on the last of those bowls. It's like, let's just focus in on what's happening and give some details on the seventh bowl of wrath. And so in Scene 3, we focus on that, and what we get is the destruction of Babylon and the destruction of the two beasts. And then finally, we come to Act 2, Scene 4, which describes the destruction of the dragon and the new creation. So that's, to me, how the book of Revelation seems to be laid out as this two-act drama. Now, there's actually one other very interesting feature of the book of Revelation that we have to wrestle with as to how it affects the structure of the book. And that's this. As you read through the book of Revelation, it sounds like that there's multiple descriptions of final judgment in the book of Revelation. What do you do with that? So, for example, let me just give you several examples of this. When you get to the sixth seal in Revelation chapter 6, verses 12 through 17, it sounds like an apparent reference to the end of time and the judgment day. So here's the sixth seal. And I looked when he broke the sixth seal, and there was a great earthquake, and the sun became as black as sackcloth made of hair, and the whole moon became like blood, and the stars of the sky fell to the earth, as when a fig tree drops its unripe figs when shaken by a great wind. The sky was split apart like a scroll when it's rolled up, and every mountain and island was removed from its place. Then the kings of the earth and the eminent people and the commanders and the wealthy and the strong and even every slave and free person hid themselves in caves and among the rocks of the mountains. And they said to the mountains and the rocks, fall on us and hide us from the sight of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. And listen to this last sentence. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who is able to stand? Sounds like, if we're talking about the great day of their wrath, sounds like we're talking about the end of time and the final day of wrath. Or you get the description of the seventh trumpet in Revelation chapter 11, verses 15 through 19. And once again, it sounds like a reference to the end and judgment day. Let me read it. The seventh angel sounded his trumpet, and there were loud voices in heaven saying, The kingdoms of this world have become the kingdom of our Lord and of his Christ, and he will reign forever and ever. If you're familiar with the Hallelujah chorus, it comes right from that. And the 24 elders who sit on their thrones before God fell on their faces and worshiped it, saying, "We give thanks, O Lord God the Almighty, the one who is and who was, because you have taken your great power and you have begun to reign. And the nations were enraged, and your wrath came, and the time for the dead to be judged, and the time to reward your bondservants, the prophets, and the saints, and those who fear your name, the small and the great, and to destroy those who destroy the earth." Again, it seems like Judgment Day. It's time for the dead to be judged. Or you get the description of the harvest of the earth in Revelation chapter 14, verses 14 through 20. And once again, sounds like an apparent reference to the end and to Judgment Day. It reads like this: "Then I looked, and behold, a white cloud, and sitting on the cloud was one like a son of man, with a golden crown on his head, and a sharp sickle was in his hand. And another angel came out of the temple, calling out with a loud voice to him who sat on the cloud, 'Put in your sickle and reap, for the hour to reap the earth has come, because the harvest of the earth is ripe.'" Sounds like we're at the end and it's time for judgment. "Then he who sat on the cloud swung his sickle over the earth was reaped. And another angel came out of the temple which is in heaven, and he also had a sharp sickle. And then another angel, the one who has power over fire, came from the altar. And he called out with a loud voice to him who had the sharp sickle, saying, 'Put in your sharp sickle and gather the clusters from the vine of the earth, because her grapes are ripe.' So the angel swung his sickle to the earth, gathered the clusters from the vine of grape, and threw them into the great winepress of the wrath of God." And this happens over and over again in the book of Revelation. The description of the seventh bowl in Revelation 16, 17 through 21, once again, sounds like an apparent reference to the end and to Judgment Day. Or the description of the slaughter of the wicked from an army led by Christ in Revelation 19, 17 through 21. Once again, sounds like the end and judgment. Then in chapter 20, you get a description of final judgment. So multiple times in the book of Revelation, it seems like we keep bumping up against, coming up to the end of time and final judgment, and then we start back over again. What do you do with that? How do you make sense of that? Well, it's pretty clear that Revelation doesn't necessarily flow in chronological order. In the very middle of the book, in chapter 12, we have a picture of the birth of Jesus and his exaltation to the throne of God, right in the middle of the book. So we know Revelation's not too worried about chronology. So I think the best way to make sense of these repeated references to final judgment in Revelation is to realize that the content of Revelation isn't intended to be chronological. The drama doesn't follow necessarily in consecutive order. What happens, rather, it seems like, is the visions in Revelation seem to be looking at the same kind of ground, the same time period, the same territory, but looking at it from slightly different angles. And so we're looking at what's happening in the world coming up towards the end of time and judgment, and then we'll pause and come back and have a different vision that looks at the same time period of human history up till final judgment. And we do that multiple times. In other words, what we have in Revelation is multiple visions, all looking at the same time period from different angles, communicating key important truths about what's happening. And that's not unusual in biblical visions. We see the exact same kind of repetition and overlap in other places in the Bible. So, for example, with the story of Joseph in the book of Genesis and Joseph's dreams of his rise to power, well, he has two different dreams using very different imagery, all about his rise to power. You have one dream of sheaves of grain bowing down to him in Genesis 37:7. Then you have another dream of sun, moon, and stars bowing down to him in Genesis 37:9. Two different dreams communicating really the same message. You get the same thing with Pharaoh and the great famine during the time period of Joseph. And so Pharaoh has a dream of 7 fat cows followed by 7 thin cows in Genesis 41, 1 through 4. And then a little bit later, he gets a dream of 7 fat ears of grain, followed by 7 thin ears of grain. 2 different dreams, but all about the same reality. Or you get in the book of Daniel's visions of the kingdoms that are going to follow after Babylon. So there's a vision of a great statue with 4 different parts in Daniel 2. Or there's the vision of the 4 beasts in Daniel chapter 7. Or there's the vision of the ram and goat in Daniel 8. And by that time, Nebuchadnezzar's dead and we've moved on. And so that's why it's a little bit different in Daniel 8. But all of those visions are all very different, but they're all about the kingdoms that are going to follow Babylon and affect what happens to Israel and the Jews. So I think Revelation is just following this pattern, doing this same thing. And it portrays various visions looking at the same kind of time period of human history leading up to the end of time so that it can communicate really key and important truths about that time period, about what's going on in the world. And Revelation lays out this drama, this 2-act drama with all these different visions, originally for the sake of the original audience, the 7 churches of Revelation. Those churches in the region of Asia. Why? Because they're undergoing really difficult pressure to be faithful to Jesus. And so I think Revelation is portraying these great truths to help them understand their situation, to bolster their confidence in God and His sovereign power and His control, and to help them see that the beasts that they were being tormented by are going to ultimately be vanquished once and for all. When John writes in Revelation 17:9, as I mentioned earlier in the recording, here is the mind which has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 hills upon which the woman sits. Everyone reading that in the first century would have known what we're talking about. It's Rome. That's one of the beasts that was tormenting those 7 churches of Asia. And so I think Revelation paints these pictures from various angles to help bolster the confidence and the faith and the faithfulness of the original audience. And then by extension, the same for us, because we still haven't come up all the way to final judgment. We're still living in this world where there's all sorts of beasts tormenting the people of God, and there's all sorts of things that make faithfulness to God difficult. And so, as Michael Gorman in his book on reading Revelation responsibly writes, he says, John is projecting high-definition images with the volume fully turned up, proclaiming, Babylon is doomed. Nothing is more certain. As in all rhetoric, the repetition of Babylon's doom and the end and these visions overlapping, the repetition is for emphasis. And the message is one of both promise and warning. Promise and warning for the people that John was originally writing to, and promise and warning for us today. So by way of summary, Revelation is like a 2-act play, a drama that shows God's sovereignty over the beasts who serve Satan and attack God's people, trying to keep them from faithfully obeying Jesus. It shows how both throughout history and ultimately when Christ returns, God sovereignly works in this world to judge and to call people to repentance. And in the end, He will vanquish the dragon and He will vanquish the beast and all of those who have aligned themselves with the dragon and with the beast. They too will be defeated and vanquished by Christ the conqueror, who will return at the end of time. And when He does, He'll bring about a brand new creation where everything is the way it's supposed to be, and He'll wipe away every tear from our eyes, and we will dwell with Him forever and ever. All right, that lays out a map then for how the book of Revelation is put together, and then in our next recording, we will begin walking through the text of Revelation together. Thanks for tuning into this session of the Listener's Commentary on the New Testament. The Listener's Commentary is a listener-supported, crowd-funded Bible teaching ministry that's only possible by the generosity of dozens and dozens of people just like you. So thanks a ton for your support, both your support via prayer, your support financially. And if you have been encouraged or challenged or blessed by this ministry in any way, would you prayerfully consider joining the team of supporters? The easiest way to do that is to go to listenerscommentary.com, click the Give button up in the upper right, and that'll redirect you to a page, my page, through World Family Mission, a registered nonprofit. And you can put in a dollar amount. If you want to make it a monthly donation, you click a little box that says Make This Monthly. And all of that will then be redirected from World Family Mission to this ministry. So thanks a ton for your support. May God bless you for it.